War Commander Vexthul stood on the bridge of his flagship, watching the blue planet slowly rotate below them. His three eyes focused on the tactical display showing the primitive world called Earth. The scans were complete, and the results were exactly what he expected. A young species with basic technology, still fighting small wars among themselves, completely unaware that their time as a free people was about to end. Signal the fleet. Vexthul ordered his communications officer. Standard conquest protocol. Broadcast surrender terms on all frequencies. He had done this 17 times before across 17 different star systems. The routine never changed. First came the demand for surrender, then orbital bombardment of military targets, then ground forces to collect the survivors for processing into the Empire's vast slave network. The Xantharian Empire had ruled the galaxy for 3,000 years. Their technology was advanced beyond measure, their fleets numbered in the millions, and their military doctrine had never failed. Species after species had knelt before their power, accepting servitude as the price of survival. This blue world would be no different. Commander, the communications officer called out, his voice carrying a note of confusion. We are receiving a response from the planet's surface. It appears to be from someone calling himself Admiral Jake Morrison of the United Earth Defense Command. Vexthul's mandibles clicked in amusement. A primitive species claiming to have a unified defense command was always entertaining. Usually their leaders spent the first few hours arguing among themselves about who had the authority to surrender. Put it through, he commanded. The main screen flickered to life, showing a human male in a dark blue uniform. The creature appeared calm, almost relaxed, as if receiving alien invasion fleets was something he dealt with every day. Greetings, Admiral Morrison said with what appeared to be a slight smile. I assume you're here about the whole conquest thing. We appreciate you following proper protocol and announcing yourselves. We'll be with you shortly. Vexthul stared at the screen for several seconds. In 3 decades of military service, no species had ever responded to surrender demands with such casual dismissal. You misunderstand, human. We are offering you the opportunity to surrender and avoid unnecessary destruction. Your compliance is not optional. Morrison's smile widened slightly. Oh, I understood perfectly. The thing is, we've been expecting you for quite some time now. Dr. Rodriguez has some fascinating theories about your species' psychology, but we'll discuss that later. Right now I need to ask you to maintain your current position while we finish our preparations. The alien commander's 3 eyes narrowed. Preparations for what exactly? For showing you why picking a fight with humanity was the worst mistake your empire ever made, Morrison replied calmly. The transmission ended. Vexthul stood in stunned silence for a moment before anger took control. Scan the entire system. I want every ship, every station, every piece of debris larger than a pebble identified and targeted. These primitives need to learn respect. The sensor officer began frantically working his controls. Commander, I'm detecting multiple anomalous readings throughout the system. Ships that weren't there during our initial sweep are appearing on sensors. They seem to be dropping some form of stealth technology. How many ships? Vexthul demanded. The officer's voice trembled slightly. 47 confirmed contacts, Commander. Possibly more. Their signatures don't match anything in our database. The design principles appear to be completely unknown. Aboard the stealth frigate Defiant, Captain Lisa Carter watched the alien fleet through her ship's advanced sensors. The Xantharian vessels were massive, bristling with weapons and armor that could probably reduce Earth's major cities to rubble in minutes. But size wasn't everything, and humanity had learned long ago that the biggest target was often the easiest one to hit. All ships report ready, Captain, her tactical officer announced. Weapons are charged and targeting solutions are locked in. Carter nodded. Signal Admiral Morrison. Tell him we're ready to begin the demonstration. Back on the Xantharian flagship, Vexthul was still trying to understand what he was seeing on his tactical display. The human ships were small compared to his massive dreadnoughts, but their movement patterns made no sense. They darted around like insects, never maintaining a predictable course or formation. Commander, his weapons officer called out urgently. The human vessels are powering weapons. Energy signatures are unlike anything in our combat databases. Open fire, Vexthul ordered. Target the largest concentration of enemy ships. Show them the power of the Empire. The Xantharian fleet opened fire with weapons that could crack planets. Massive energy beams lanced through space toward the human formation. But when the light cleared, the human ships were no longer where they had been. They had scattered in all directions, moving faster than the aliens' targeting. Computers could track, then the humans fired back. The weapons that struck the Xantharian scout ships were unlike anything the Empire had encountered. In 3,000 years of conquest, they didn't simply destroy their targets with brute force. Instead, they seemed to turn the aliens' own technology against them. Shield generators overloaded and exploded. Weapon systems fired wildly into space before shutting down completely. Life support systems began venting atmosphere into the void. Within minutes, 3 Xantharian vessels had been reduced to drifting hulks. The crews that survived sent frantic damage reports that made no technical sense. Their own systems had somehow been turned into weapons against them. Impossible, Vexthal whispered, staring at the tactical display. Their technology is primitive. Our scouts confirmed it. They barely have space travel. Commander, the communications officer reported with barely controlled panic. We're receiving another transmission from the human admiral. Morrison appeared on screen again, still calm, still smiling. I hope that was educational for you, Commander. We've been studying your technology for quite some time now. Dr. Rodriguez finds your shield harmonics particularly interesting. Shall we continue the lesson? Or would you prefer to withdraw and report to your superiors that humanity is not as primitive as your scouts believed? Vexthal's voice was barely a whisper as he stared at the human on his screen. That kind of power couldn't possibly be human. Morrison's smile never wavered. Commander, you have no idea what humanity is capable of when we put our minds to it. This is just the beginning. Vexthal paced the bridge of his flagship like a caged predator. 3 days had passed since the first disastrous encounter with human forces, and his situation had only gotten worse. The reinforcements he had called for were still 2 weeks away, and the humans were not giving him time to think or regroup. Another patrol has gone silent. Commander, his tactical officer reported with barely concealed fear. That makes 7 ships in the past 12 hours. They simply vanish from our sensors. Then we find debris fields hours later. The debris fields were what truly disturbed Vexthal. The wreckage showed signs of weapons that shouldn't exist, damage patterns that defied every principle of known warfare. Some ships looked like they had been torn apart from the inside. Others appeared to have been destroyed by their own weapons turning against them. The humans weren't just winning these engagements. They were making Xantharian technology itself betray its creators. Captain Lisa Carter studied the tactical display aboard the Defiant as her ship glided silently through an asteroid field. Her crew had just finished planting their latest surprise for the aliens, a minefield that would activate only when Xantharian ships approached. The mines themselves were built from salvaged alien technology, improved with human engineering, and programmed with targeting systems that would make them nearly impossible to detect or disable. Captain, her communications officer whispered, we're receiving a transmission from Colonel Torres on the surface. His ground teams are ready to begin the next phase. Carter nodded. The surface operations were perhaps the most important part of their strategy. While her ships kept the alien fleet busy in space, Torres and his people were evacuating civilian populations through a network of underground tunnels that had been under construction for decades. The aliens thought they were fighting a desperate last stand, but they were actually facing the most prepared defensive campaign in human history. On Earth's surface, Colonel Sam Torres crouched in the ruins of what had once been a major city. The Xantharians had begun their bombardment campaign 2 days ago, reducing population centers to rubble. What they didn't know was that the cities had been mostly empty. Humanity's leaders had spent years preparing for this exact scenario, building vast underground complexes that could house millions of people for months. Sir, one of his soldiers whispered, the alien landing force is approaching the industrial sector. Maya's latest creation is ready for testing. Torres smiled grimly. Maya Patel had once been a civilian engineer working on mining equipment. Now she was humanity's most creative weapons designer, building impossible devices from spare parts and pure determination. Her latest project was something she called the Urban Renewal System, and Torres was eager to see if it worked as advertised. The Xantharian ground force consisted of 300 heavily armored soldiers supported by combat vehicles that could level city blocks. They moved through the destroyed streets with confidence, their sensors showing no signs of human military presence. Their mission was simple: establish a forward base and begin processing any surviving civilians for transport to slave processing centers. They never saw Maya's trap coming. The buildings around them had been rigged with mining charges, connected to motion sensors and automated targeting systems. But Maya hadn't stopped there. She had also connected the charges to the city's old water distribution system, creating a network of improvised weapons that turned every fire hydrant, water main, and drainage pipe into a potential cannon. When the Xantharian force reached the center of the industrial sector, the city itself attacked them. Explosions erupted from manholes, sending jets of superheated steam and debris into their ranks. Building facades collapsed in carefully calculated sequences, creating kill zones that channeled the aliens into areas where hidden human teams waited with weapons salvaged from their own dead scouts. But the most devastating surprise came when Maya's crowning achievement activated. She had somehow figured out how to turn the aliens' own communication systems against them. Every Xantharian radio, every tactical display, every targeting computer suddenly began broadcasting false information. Their own equipment told them that enemies were everywhere and nowhere, that their weapons were empty when they were full, that their allies were enemies, and their enemies were allies. In the confusion that followed, Torres and his team struck. They moved through the chaos like ghosts, using weapons that ranged from advanced energy rifles to improvised explosives made from kitchen chemicals. The Xantharians found themselves fighting an enemy that seemed to be everywhere at once, using tactics that violated every principle of honorable warfare. Above the planet, Sub-Commander Kyle Rex watched the tactical feeds from the ground assault with growing horror. He was young for a Xantharian officer, but he had studied every major campaign in the Empire's history. What he was seeing on his screens made no sense according to everything he had been taught about warfare. The humans fight without honor, he whispered to his aide. They use their own cities as weapons. They turn our technology against us. They make war itself into something unrecognizable. His aide, an older soldier who had served in the Great Cleansing, shook his head slowly. No, young one. They fight to win. We fight for honor and glory. They fight for survival. There is a difference. In space, Maya Patel was about to demonstrate that human creativity extended far beyond ground warfare. She had spent the last 3 days converting a civilian cargo hauler into something that would redefine space combat. The ship itself was worthless, a century-old freight vessel that barely qualified as spaceworthy. But Maya had filled its cargo holds with mining charges, connected them to a guidance system salvaged from alien wreckage, and programmed the whole contraption to accelerate toward the largest Xantharian ship it could find. The aliens saw the ancient freighter approaching and dismissed it as a desperate suicide attack. Their point defense systems could easily destroy such a primitive vessel before it got close enough to cause damage. What they didn't realize was that Maya had anticipated this response and planned accordingly. When the Xantharian weapons destroyed the cargo ship, they triggered Maya's real weapon. The mining charges didn't explode outward like a normal bomb. Instead, they had been configured to create a kinetic lance, focusing all their destructive energy into a narrow beam that punched through armor like it was paper. The heavy cruiser Eternal Glory, pride of the Xantharian fleet, was cut in half by what amounted to a garbage truck full of mining explosives. As Vexthal watched his finest ship break apart, he felt something he had never experienced in 3 decades of conquest. Genuine fear. These humans didn't just fight differently. They fought in ways that seemed to ignore the fundamental laws of physics and common sense. They turned every disadvantage into an advantage, every weakness into a strength. The final blow to his confidence came when Dr. Alex Rodriguez appeared on his communication screen. The human scientist looked tired but satisfied, like someone who had just solved a particularly difficult puzzle. "Commander Vexthal," Rodriguez said politely, "I wanted to thank you for providing such excellent research material. Your species' technology is quite impressive, but we've found several ways to improve it. Would you like to see what we've learned?" Before Vexthal could respond, his sensors detected something impossible. Human ships were appearing throughout the system, but they weren't using any known method of faster-than-light travel. They seemed to be stepping out of normal space entirely, bypassing the hyperspace lanes that every other species used for interstellar travel. Impossible, Vexthal breathed. No species has ever developed independent FTL technology. The hyperspace lanes are the only way to travel between stars. Rodriguez smiled. Commander, you've been using technology for so long that you've forgotten how to really understand it. We've been reverse engineering your equipment for decades, but we don't just copy what we find. We improve it, we adapt it, we make it better. Your hyperspace lanes are very efficient, but they're also predictable. Our method is slower, but much more flexible. As if to prove his point, more human ships continued to appear around the Xantharian fleet, materializing from directions that should have been empty space. Vexthul realized with growing horror that his enemy had been preparing for this war far longer than he had imagined. They had not only learned to use alien technology, they had learned to surpass it. Emperor Zarthok sat upon his crystal throne in the heart of the imperial palace, listening to reports that made no sense. For the first time in his 1,000-year reign, he was hearing words that had never before been spoken in the throne room. Defeat, retreat, impossible technology, and most disturbing of all, fear. Bring me High Admiral Morgax, the Emperor commanded, his voice echoing through the vast chamber. If anyone could make sense of these reports about primitive humans destroying entire fleets, it would be the Empire's greatest military mind. High Admiral Morgax had conquered 43 star systems in his career. He had personally overseen the Great Cleansing that had eliminated the Vorth Rebellion, and his tactical genius was studied in military academies across the Empire. When he appeared before the Emperor, his 4 arms were crossed in the traditional gesture of absolute confidence. My Emperor, Morgax declared, I have reviewed the reports from the human system. Vexthul allowed himself to be confused by clever tricks and unconventional tactics. The Third Imperial Fleet will crush this rebellion within days of our arrival. Emperor Zarthok leaned forward on his throne. These humans destroyed a heavy cruiser with a cargo vessel filled with mining charges. They turn our own technology against us. They appear and disappear at will. Are these merely clever tricks? Desperation, my Emperor. A cornered animal will fight in ways that seem impossible, but desperation is no match for superior numbers and technology. I will deploy the Third Fleet's full strength and end this embarrassment quickly. Meanwhile, in the asteroid belt around Mars, Commander Rio Santos was about to test humanity's latest achievement. The fighter craft he sat in looked like nothing that had ever flown before, a hybrid of human engineering and alien technology that pushed both beyond their original limits. Every system had been redesigned, every component improved, every safety limitation deliberately ignored. Control, this is Shadow 1, Santos reported into his radio. All systems green. The new engines are responding perfectly. I'm reading power levels that should be impossible. In the control room of the hidden asteroid base, Professor Helen Chang watched the test flight data with satisfaction. She had spent months figuring out how Xantharian technology really worked, not just how it was supposed to work according to their manuals, but how the underlying physics actually functioned. The discoveries had been revolutionary. Santos, she called over the radio, we're ready to test the shield modifications. Remember, what we're about to do should be impossible according to alien engineering principles. Their shields are designed to absorb and deflect energy. We figured out how to make them do something else entirely. Santos engaged the modified shield system and watched his instrument panel light up with warnings. According to every gauge in his cockpit, his ship was about to explode. According to Professor Chang's calculations, his ship was about to become the most dangerous single fighter craft in galactic history. The test target was a captured Xantharian escort vessel, fully powered and defended by its original shield systems. Santos approached at maximum speed, his modified fighter screaming through space faster than anything its size had any right to move. When he fired, his weapons did something that made every alien engineer who later studied the recordings question their understanding of basic physics. Instead of trying to penetrate the enemy shields, Santos's weapons turned the shields themselves into a weapon. The energy field that was supposed to protect the Xantharian ship suddenly collapsed inward, creating a contained fusion explosion that tore the vessel apart from the inside. It was as if the ship had been destroyed by its own defensive systems. Test successful, Santos reported calmly, though his hands were shaking as he spoke. The target is completely destroyed. Professor Chang, your modifications work exactly as advertised. When High Admiral Morgax arrived in the Sol system with the Third Imperial Fleet, he brought with him 500 of the Empire's finest warships, including his personal flagship Infinity's Edge, a dreadnought so massive it could serve as a mobile space station. His confidence was absolute, his strategy flawless, his victory inevitable. The human fleet that rose to meet him numbered only 50 ships, most of them smaller than his smallest escorts. Morgax watched them approach on his tactical display and felt a moment of disappointment. After all the reports of impossible technology and unconventional tactics, he had expected something more impressive. "All ships, commence primary bombardment," he ordered. "Target the largest human vessels first. Show them the true power of the Empire." The Third Fleet opened fire with weapons that could crack moons. Energy beams powerful enough to level continents lanced through space toward the human formation. It should have been the end of human resistance, the final demonstration of Xantharian superiority. Instead, something impossible happened. The human ships didn't try to dodge the incoming fire. They didn't raise shields or return fire. Instead, they seemed to absorb the energy of the Xantharian weapons and use it to power their own systems. Their hulls glowed with captured energy, their weapons charged with power stolen from their enemies. Their engines accelerated to speeds that defied every known law of physics. Commander Santos led the human counterattack in his modified fighter, followed by 49 identical craft that moved like a single organism. They flowed through the Xantharian formation like water through a net, their weapons turning enemy shields into bombs, their speed making them impossible to target, their tactics making no sense to any military mind trained in conventional warfare. High Admiral Morgax watched his tactical display with growing horror as his fleet began to disintegrate. Ships that had never known defeat were exploding around him, destroyed by their own defensive systems turned against them. His escorts, his cruisers, his battleships, all falling to an enemy that fought like no species in galactic history. "Impossible," he whispered, echoing the words of every Xantharian commander who had faced human forces. "They're using our own technology against us. They're making our shields into weapons. They're turning our strengths into weaknesses." His communications officer turned toward him with panic in his three eyes. "Admiral, we're receiving reports from across the fleet. The humans have somehow accessed our tactical networks. They know where every ship is positioned, what weapons we're carrying, even what our next moves will be before we make them." In the hidden asteroid bases scattered throughout the Sol system, teams of human technicians monitored the battle through systems that had been built from captured alien technology, but improved beyond recognition. They could see every Xantharian ship, hear every communication, predict every tactical decision. The aliens had brought superior numbers and firepower, but the humans had brought superior intelligence and preparation. Admiral Morrison watched the battle from the bridge of his flagship, noting with satisfaction that every element of their defense was working exactly as planned. The aliens still thought they were fighting a desperate last stand by a primitive species. They had no idea they were facing the culmination of decades of preparation, planning, and technological development. "Signal all ships," Morrison ordered. "Begin Phase 2 of the operation. It's time to show them what else we've learned from their technology." Across the human fleet, weapon systems that had been hidden until now came online. These weren't just improved versions of Xantharian technology. These were weapons based on principles the aliens had never imagined. Powered by energy sources they didn't understand, guided by targeting systems that seemed to predict the future. High Admiral Morgax watched his flagship's shields fail under weapons fire that should not have been possible. His final transmission to the Imperial fleet was a whisper of disbelief. "They fight without honor, without rules, without mercy. They adapt faster than we can compensate. This is not war, this is extinction. All ships retreat immediately. The Empire must be warned." As the surviving ships of the Third Imperial Fleet fled toward the edge of the system, Santos and his squadron made one final demonstration of human capabilities. They pursued the retreating aliens at speeds that should have torn their ships apart, using weapons that turned space itself into a weapon, proving that humanity had not just adapted alien technology, but had transcended it entirely. The emergency session of the Imperial Council had been called for the first time in 3 centuries. Emperor Zarthok stood before the assembled governors, admirals, and ministers of his empire, holding reports that challenged everything they thought they knew about warfare technology and their own invincibility. "The Third Imperial Fleet is gone," the Emperor announced, his voice carrying across the silent chamber. 500 ships, including High Admiral Morgax himself, destroyed or scattered by a force of 50 human vessels. This is not defeat, Council members. This is something we have never experienced in 3,000 years of conquest. Governor Yexmol of the Outer Territories raised one of his 4 arms in a gesture of confusion. My Emperor, surely this is some form of mistake. No primitive species could possess such capabilities. Perhaps the reports have been exaggerated by panicked survivors. The Emperor's 3 eyes fixed on the governor with a stare that could freeze plasma. I have reviewed the tactical recordings myself, Governor. These humans have not simply acquired our technology. They have improved it, weaponized it, and turned it against us in ways that our own engineers claim are impossible. What the Imperial Council didn't know was that their discussion was being monitored. Deep within Xantharian space, Agent Nina cross-sat in a hidden facility that officially didn't exist, listening to every word through communication systems that the aliens believed were completely secure. Nina had been living among the Xantharians for 15 years, carefully building an identity as a minor bureaucrat in their resource management division. Her true mission was intelligence gathering, and in 15 years she had mapped every major military installation, supply route, and strategic weakness in the Empire's core systems. "Control, this is Deep Eye," she whispered into her concealed transmitter. "The Imperial Council is in full emergency session. They're talking about fortress protocols and pulling back to their core worlds. I'm transmitting complete tactical data on their defensive installations now." Thousands of light years away, General Marcus Webb received Nina's intelligence data and smiled grimly. He had been planning Operation Deep Strike for 5 years, waiting for exactly this moment when the Empire would be off balance and desperate. The information Nina provided would allow human forces to strike at the heart of Xantharian power before they could recover from their losses. "Signal all deep strike teams," Webb ordered his staff. "It's time to show the Empire that nowhere in their territory is safe from human forces. Begin simultaneous operations against targets Alpha through Romeo." The attack on the Kexthera supply depot was humanity's first demonstration that they could operate deep inside enemy territory. The depot was supposedly impregnable, protected by automated defenses and surrounded by a minefield that could destroy anything larger than a small asteroid. It was also the primary fuel and ammunition supply point for the Empire's border fleets. Captain Rogers led the assault team through the minefield using ships that had been built specifically for this mission. They were small, fast, and equipped with stealth systems that made them nearly invisible to Xantharian sensors. More importantly, they carried weapons that had been designed to turn the depot's own defensive systems against it. The attack lasted exactly 17 minutes. When it was over, the supply depot was gone, along with enough fuel and ammunition to supply 3 Imperial fleets for a full year. The automated distress signal that reached Xantharian High Command contained weapon signatures that didn't match anything in their databases and tactical recordings that showed impossible technologies in action. But the supply depot was just the beginning. Across 12 different star systems, human strike teams were simultaneously attacking targets that the Empire had considered absolutely secure. Shipyards that had been building warships for centuries vanished in explosions that could be seen from neighboring planets. Communication relays that connected the Empire's vast territory went silent one by one. Military academies where the next generation of officers was being trained received visits from humans who left only empty buildings behind. The most devastating attack came at the fortress world of Morkex, where the Empire's greatest military minds had gathered to plan a counteroffensive against humanity. The planet itself was a weapon, covered with defensive installations that could destroy entire fleets, protected by shield generators that could withstand direct hits from planet-killer weapons. The human assault force that approached Morkex consisted of only 20 ships, so small that the planetary defenses almost didn't bother to engage them. That was their first mistake. Their second mistake was assuming that the approaching vessels were actually ships at all. What the Xantharians thought were human attack craft were actually mobile manufacturing platforms, ships that could land on a planet's surface and begin producing weapons, vehicles, and even more ships from local materials. Within hours of landing, the humans had established a manufacturing base that was turning Morkex's own mineral resources into weapons designed specifically to destroy Xantharian defenses. The battle for Morkex lasted 3 days and ended with the complete destruction of the planet's military infrastructure. But the real shock came when the human forces didn't stop there. Instead of withdrawing after their victory, they began building permanent installations, turning the fortress world into a human military base in the heart of Xantharian space. Emperor Zarthok received the reports from Morkex while sitting in his private chambers, surrounded by tactical displays that showed human forces operating throughout his empire. Red markers indicated destroyed installations, yellow markers showed facilities under attack, and green markers represented the few remaining strongholds that hadn't yet been touched by human operations. "How is this possible?" he whispered to his aide, an ancient Xantharian who had served the imperial family for 5 centuries. "Our intelligence networks reported no signs of human ships in our territory. Our border patrols detected no unauthorized intrusions. How did they get so many forces so deep into our space without being detected?" The aide's response was barely audible. "My Emperor, I believe they have been here much longer than we imagined. The reports suggest that some of these facilities were destroyed using detailed knowledge of their internal layouts and security systems. This level of intelligence could only come from years of observation and preparation." As if to confirm his worst fears, the Emperor's communication system activated with an incoming transmission. The screen showed Admiral Morrison, the human, who had started this nightmare, sitting calmly in what appeared to be a command center filled with displays showing Xantharian star systems. "Your Imperial Majesty," Morrison said with polite formality, "I hope you're beginning to understand the situation you find yourself in. We've been preparing for this conflict much longer than you realize. Your territory is no longer secure. Your fleets are scattered, and your people are beginning to question whether the Empire can protect them." Emperor Zarthok leaned forward, his voice carrying the authority of 3,000 years of imperial rule. "What do you want, human? Terms for surrender? Tribute? Territory?" Morrison's expression didn't change. "We want you to understand that this war is already over, Your Majesty. You lost the moment you decided to attack Earth. Everything that happens from this point forward is simply us demonstrating that fact to the rest of the galaxy." The transmission ended, leaving the Emperor staring at a blank screen while alarms began sounding throughout the Imperial Palace. His personal guard rushed into the chamber with reports that human ships had been detected approaching the capital system itself. "Impossible," Emperor Zarthok whispered, using the word that had become the Empire's unofficial motto since encountering humanity. "The capital system is protected by the ancient defense grid. No enemy force has ever penetrated those defenses." His guard captain's response carried a note of panic that the Emperor had never heard before. "My lord, the ancient defense grid is still active, but it's no longer under our control. The approaching human fleet appears to be using our own defensive systems as navigation beacons." As Emperor Zarthok stared at the tactical displays showing human forces approaching the heart of his empire, he finally understood what Admiral Morrison had been trying to tell him. This wasn't a war between two civilizations. This was an execution, carried out by a species that had turned the Empire's own technology, its own territory, and its own defensive systems into weapons against itself. The Battle of Xanthar Prime began at dawn on the Imperial homeworld. Though the concept of dawn had little meaning, when the sky was filled with ships from 2 different civilizations preparing for what everyone knew would be the final engagement of the war, Emperor Zarthok stood on the observation deck of his palace, watching the human fleet take positions around his planet. There were more ships than his intelligence reports had suggested possible, vessels that seemed to appear from nowhere and position themselves with mathematical precision around every strategic point on Xanthar. Prime. Admiral Morrison's flagship moved into orbit directly above the Imperial Palace, close enough that the Emperor could see individual weapon ports with his naked eyes. The message was clear. Humanity had the power to end this war at any moment, but they were choosing to offer one final opportunity for communication. The transmission from the human admiral reached the Emperor's personal communication system minutes later. Morrison appeared on screen looking tired but determined, like someone who had carried a heavy burden for a long time and was finally ready to set it down. "Your Imperial Majesty," Morrison began with formal politeness, I'm contacting you to offer final terms for the end of this conflict. The Xantharian Empire has been defeated, your fleets are scattered, and your military infrastructure has been systematically dismantled. What happens next depends entirely on your response to our conditions. Emperor Zarthok drew himself up to his full impressive height, every inch the ruler of a galactic empire. Admiral Morrison, you have achieved remarkable victories through unconventional tactics and superior preparation. The Imperial Council is prepared to offer humanity an honored place within the Empire. You would have autonomy over your home system and representation in our government. Surely this is preferable to continued warfare. Morrison's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes suggested that he had expected this exact response. Your Majesty, I think you still don't understand what's happening here. We're not negotiating for a place in your empire. We're here to end your empire entirely. The Emperor's three eyes widened in disbelief. End the empire? Admiral, the Xantharian Empire has existed for 3,000 years. We have brought order to the galaxy, unified countless species under a single government, created the greatest civilization in galactic history. You cannot simply end something that fundamental. Your Majesty, Morrison replied quietly, your empire was built on conquest and slavery. Every species you unified was unified through force. Every world you brought order to was ordered to serve your interests. We've spent the last several months liberating the species you've kept in chains, and I can tell you that none of them want your empire to continue existing. As if summoned by Morrison's words, the Emperor's communication system began receiving transmissions from across the galaxy. World after world, species after species, the enslaved populations of the Empire were broadcasting the same message. The Xantharian Empire was finished, and they would never again bow to alien masters. Captain Lisa Carter led the final assault on the planetary defense systems, her ship dancing through defensive fire that could have destroyed a moon. The Xantharian defenses were impressive, built by the greatest military engineers in galactic history, powered by technology that had protected the homeworld for millennia. But Carter had something the defenses hadn't been designed to handle: complete knowledge of how they worked, detailed plans of every system and subsystem, and weapons specifically designed to turn those defenses against themselves. Within minutes, the orbital defense platforms were firing on each other while their targeting computers insisted they were engaging human ships. The ground assault that followed was unlike anything in the history of warfare. Human forces didn't storm the Imperial Palace with overwhelming numbers or devastating weapons. Instead, they simply walked through defenses that had been convinced to ignore them, past guards whose own equipment insisted the humans weren't there, into the throne room itself. Emperor Zarthok found himself face to face with Admiral Morrison in his own throne room, surrounded by human soldiers who had somehow bypassed every security system in the palace. His personal guard stood frozen, their weapons trained on enemies their targeting systems claimed didn't exist. How? Was all the Emperor could manage to say. Morrison gestured toward the massive windows that showed the human fleet in orbit above them. Your Majesty, you've been fighting the same kind of war for 3,000 years. You conquer through superior technology and overwhelming force. We studied your methods, learned your technology, and then we did what humanity does best. We improved on what we learned. But this is more than just better technology, the Emperor protested. You fight without honor, without rules, without any respect for the traditions of warfare. You turn our own systems against us, you strike without warning, you show no mercy to defeated enemies. Morrison nodded slowly. You're absolutely right, Your Majesty. We don't fight for honor or glory or tradition. We fight to win, and more importantly, we fight to ensure that our enemies can never threaten anyone again. Your empire has enslaved the galaxy for 3 millennia. We're here to make sure that never happens again. The Emperor looked around his throne room, at the human soldiers who had appeared like ghosts, at the displays showing his fleet being systematically disabled rather than destroyed, at the Admiral who had somehow defeated the greatest military force in galactic history. What are your terms? He asked finally. Morrison's response was simple and final. The Xantharian Empire ends today. Your military forces will be disbanded. Your enslaved populations will be granted immediate independence, and your homeworld will be placed under international supervision to ensure you never again attempt to conquer other species. Any attempt to rebuild your military or interfere with other worlds will result in consequences that will make this conflict look like a friendly disagreement. Emperor Zarthok closed his 3 eyes and was silent for a long moment. When he opened them again, he looked older than his 1,000 years. Admiral Morrison, I have ruled the galaxy for longer than your species has existed. I have seen the rise and fall of countless civilizations. In all that time, I have never encountered a species like humanity. We called you primitive when we first encountered your world. We called you weak when you refused our terms. We were wrong about everything. You don't just fight to win. You fight to ensure your enemies can never threaten anyone again. You don't conquer worlds, you liberate them. You don't build empires, you tear them down. The Emperor stood from his crystal throne for the last time and looked directly at Admiral Morrison. The galaxy belongs to humanity now, whether you claim it or not. Every species that was enslaved by my empire will remember that humans freed them. Every world that suffered under Xantharian rule will know that humanity ended their suffering. You have become the dominant power in the galaxy without even trying. Morrison considered the Emperor's words carefully before responding. Your Majesty, humanity has no interest in ruling the galaxy. We've seen what empires do to both the conquered and the conquerors. We're here to ensure that every species has the right to determine its own future, free from the threat of conquest or enslavement. Instead of an empire, we're proposing something different. A galactic council where every species has an equal voice, where disputes are resolved through negotiation rather than warfare, where the strong are prevented from preying on the weak. It won't be perfect, but it will be better than what came before. Emperor Zarthok nodded slowly, understanding finally dawning in his ancient eyes. You came here not to replace my empire with your own, but to ensure that no empire could ever again do what mine has done. You fight not for conquest but for freedom, not for domination but for justice. As the last emperor of the Xantharian Empire formally surrendered to Admiral Morrison, broadcasts were already being transmitted to every corner of the galaxy. The message was simple. The age of empires was over. The age of freedom had begun, and humanity had proven that no force in the universe was more powerful than a species that refused to accept defeat. Years later, historians would mark this moment as the beginning of the Galactic Age, when the species of the galaxy learned to work together as equals, rather than as masters and slaves. And they would remember that it all began when an empire that had never known fear encountered a species that had never learned to surrender. The empire had trembled, and that kind of power truly had been human after all.